right.
Well, good evening. Let me add my welcome to you all, and it is tremendous to see such a large turnout. I think one of the themes that's already emerging tonight is that little in the aid and development industry is clear-cut or straightforward. This is one of the reasons why an event like this is just so important. They create a really important forum for us to discuss the complexity around the issues of aid effectiveness. So let me perhaps come down from the lofty heights of Paris declarations and DACs and other acronyms and see if we can give a bit of a sense of what this is like on the ground. That said, I'm not going to make your job tonight any easier. I'm still going to be, I suppose, emphasising just how complex the job is. Aid and development is a messy business, to use a technical term. But first, let me start with what we do know. There is solid evidence that most development projects implemented in the sector that I'm from, the international non-government organisations, deliver on their key intended outputs. That's good news. And in addition, in some key areas, international NGOs achieve development goals more cost-effectively than other actors. You're not going to ask an international NGO to perhaps do a major infrastructure project, but in areas like health and education, building public awareness, international NGOs have a very strong track record. But of course, their impact is not limited to just the implementation of projects. They've also contributed very significantly to local, national and global policy change, and it might be in this area that their contribution to poverty alleviation is actually greatest. And examples, of course, is the role that NGOs have played in the development of a human rights framework. You can point to issues like the establishment of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the reform of the World Bank, and of course supporting movements like Make Poverty History. However, and this is the yes but, from here, answering the question, does aid work, starts to become a little bit more complicated. And there's three key reasons for this. Firstly, there's a really big difference between outputs and outcomes. For example, while a project might provide community access to clean water by, say, building wells or something like that, that's just an output. And it does not necessarily mean that it reduces, for example, infant mortality, which is likely to be the outcome that you're after. For example, people might fail to wash their hands before handling that clean water and thus undermine the project. Secondly, it's very difficult to measure the outcomes of a project, and that issue's already come out. Now, one obvious solution, you might say, is to ask beneficiaries themselves. I recently visited a women's microcredit program in Tanzania, and I did just that. I walked around and asked the women who had started businesses just what a difference that business had made to their life and that of their families. Certainly some talked about the importance of health outcomes and another about the ability to send her children to school. But the one that really struck me was the woman who said, "I used to borrow salt from my neighbours, now they borrow salt from me." How do you measure this sort of sense of empowerment and improve self-esteem that this woman felt? How do you aggregate it with other factors? That's a real challenge. And of course, the outcomes might be very indirect. And again, let me illustrate with an example. A few years ago, I was in some slums on the outskirts of Delhi, and the day I visited, it was about 46 degrees, and in those very cramped conditions, with very poor sanitation. You can imagine the dust, the smell, and just what it was like. Now, the women of the slums had organised themselves with the assistance of an international NGO into groups of around 20 neighbours. And throughout this slum there were hundreds of these sorts of groups. And upon joining, each person was expected to be able to demonstrate their saving capacity by depositing about 10 to 20 rupees a week, which is about 40 cents or 60 cents. And after about 6 months of being able to demonstrate your ability to save, you are entitled to apply for your first loan. And of course, the successful loans were determined democratically and normally would initially be used to improve things like the family's health or education, and then sometimes on second or third loans would go on to create businesses. Now, since the borrowers knew each other, they were neighbours, they were aware of each other's circumstances, and so that had a couple of effects. One is that the loan repayment was very high. You understood how poor your neighbours were and how hard won those savings were. And second of all, if one of your neighbours did get into trouble, genuine trouble, then you would often say, look, let's extend it for a month or two. Now, as a result, in addition to the financial benefits that the group gave, there was incredible moral support that also came out of this. Now, all of this contributed to an enormous sense of community empowerment that in turn led to a whole range of other initiatives. They organised committees for a whole range of issues of common concern. So they started with sanitation issues and water supply issues. They then got mobilised around creating green space for their children and even things like footpaths. And unlike many perhaps more well-off people in developed countries that might grumble and complain about government inaction, what these women did was got on with the job, designed the plans, and then invited the local government to actually participate in the plans that they had created. The indirect benefits of the original program were absolutely massive. Improved sanitation and water supply, green space for children to play cricket, and a better urban environment. Now, all of these are undoubtedly very, very important contributions that the original program made, but of course none of them were in the original design. So again, how do you capture the complexity of those sorts of indirect benefits?